Welcome to this HR panel on remote leadership development, nurturing leaders in a virtual environment. I'm really excited to have Marcia and Jomana with me today for this conversation. The topic of developing leaders in a remote environment is something that has come up with my clients and in conversations with HR colleagues a lot recently, and I feel like a lot more this year or even sort of late 2023. We've been thinking about how to continuously engage leaders who either work across different offices or are in a remote environment, and to ensure that we have a strong leadership bench despite being in very diverse locations. So this conversation will be about leadership skills as it relates to a remote leadership. We'll talk about some innovative techniques to execute on leadership development initiatives, technology, as well as how to create high levels of engagement and a strong culture in a remote environment. With that said, welcome to the panel, Marcia and Jomana, and I'm going to get started with our first question about challenges that before we dive into solutions here. What are some of the common challenges that you hear and that you notice in your HR roles that come up with developing leaders in a remote setup? Marcia, if you can get us started. And as you do, please also give a quick introduction about who you are and what your role and responsibilities are.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and definitely looking forward to continuing on the conversation. I am Marcia R. Bonner. I am a senior HR how do I want to say, business executive. Always I add that into the HR because sometimes that's missed. And as well as a DEIB senior consultant. Right now I am spending time working with MRW Consulting Group, LLC, doing consulting work as I've recently transitioned. Or in transition, let me put that. And that's always something that HR people are involved in their careers, just moving forward. The journey continues. So again, I'm happy to be here and provide some insight into developing leadership skills in a remote work setting, that being the first question. And, when I think about what I've been having to engage with in the workplace, it's conflicting priorities that always rises to the top, fosters misunderstanding about the strategic direction of the organization. Also, the non-collaborative senior executives, not that they don't want to be collaborative, but time is of the essence, especially in a remote work environment, when you have one meeting after the other, and there's not enough space that allows for the employee or the senior executive to spend time with each other. Inappropriate or differing leadership styles is also a challenge. There are some leaders who are very autocratic, and then there are some who are pretty much laid back, laissez-faire, if you don't mind me using that term, where they just kind of let folks do what it is they feel that they should be doing. But that leadership style doesn't always resonate well with all employees. And then you've got the organizational structure, whether it's remote or non-remote, understanding the structure continues to be a challenge that a lot of organizations face. And then, of course, you've got talent issues, lack of regular check-ins, knowing where people are, what their styles are as it relates to being in a remote environment. And then you have employees who don't always want to speak up, as it relates to the concerns that they're having. So these are just some of the challenges that I have faced in the workplace recently, and as the remote work environment continues. And I do want to also share this quickly, Ramona. Hybrid and remote are not new to a lot of organizations. It has been lifted up as a result of the pandemic, but many organizations have been working and using the hybrid and remote environment for quite a while, along with the in-person. So conflicting priorities, non-collaborative senior executives, inappropriate leadership styles, poor organizational design, neglect of talent issues, and fearful employees are at the top of my list of things that I've had to deal with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. And I want to call out the inappropriate leadership styles, right? Sometimes when we sort of learn leadership skills and we're in an office, one style may actually work really well. And then when we start to lead across different offices or in a remote or hybrid environment, and we're not adapting our style to this new situation, that's when friction can often show up, at least from my perspective.
Absolutely.
Jomana, how about you?
Thanks, Marcia. I think you covered quite a bit of what we're seeing in remote and first environments. Really quickly, I'm Jomana Elwany. Pronouns are she, her. I'm the head of people here at Community. I want to echo off what Marcia shared earlier, and that's the the conflicting messaging and direction that's coming from leadership. And I think that's coming from communication gaps that we're seeing in remote first environments or remote friendly environments. And that is causing a lot of miscommunication, misdirection, that he said, she said, they said conflict in the organizations that lead to conflict and misalignment. We talk about, most companies have shifted to being remote friendly, I would say, for the most part since the pandemic. Whereas a lot haven't really put the intention in being remote first and building those remote first strategies that would support an effective remote first environment. We've done well moving to remote friendly, but do we have the structures in place that really make us remote first? And that's where, with the communication gaps, you'll see the difference between companies that are doing this very well versus those that are struggling is they have implemented really structured communication plans. Because when you're used to being in person or in an office, you're typically used to everyone being in the same room, being, within reach to communicate, or they're in loop of direction or strategies or, where we're moving. Whereas when you're in a remote environment, a lot of that is siloed. So typically where you see the gap is, at the executive level, decisions are being made and, you get the direction, Kate, go ahead. And then you move on those directions, but then there's that middle managers that are lacking that are misinformed, that are, not looped in. So you go from leadership to, frontline organization facing, and you missed communicating with your key, especially line managers. And that's where that gap is. So I would say, that communication gap, from what I've seen has been one of the struggles. And then echo what Marcia said, what I'm hearing from my line managers is managing that isolation and lack of interaction that is impacting their employees. So I would say those are the two challenges that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for adding this. And it's interesting that you bring up the engagement. I want to actually hone in there a little bit more. Quickly, also acknowledging that Andrea Ehlers tried to join us for the VP and VP of HRIS and People Operations at cart.com. She has some choppy internet connection, so we'll see if she's able to join the panel in a little bit. Now, so on to the conversation or the question around engagement. There's on one hand the engagement of leaders as we think about leadership development and how do we keep them engaged in leadership development initiatives, but also for leaders, how do we help them and equip them with the skills to engage their teams? What are some of the ways that you have successfully or lessons learned from unfruitful endeavors? What would you share as best practices?
You want to jump in?
Sure. What I've learned, include them in conversations, create channels of communication, lines for them to reach out to your leadership team, lines for them to share feedback. They need to feel heard. They need to be heard. They need to be included to get their engagement, especially in a remote environment when you're lacking that emotional connection to an organization that you would typically get in in-person environments. And to get their buy-in and support. I think that is so critical. I know, Marcia, you were nodding hard when I started.
This is the, employee engagement, be it remote or in person or hybrid, is a big deal. And, one size does not fit all, right? So, at my last organization, we spent a lot of time, and I want to say this. You mentioned remote first. We were kind of using employee excellence from everywhere, right? And that kind of is brings in that whole idea of belonging, that no matter where you are, what it is you're doing, you are a part of the organization, because we see our employees everywhere. And I don't know whether or not others are familiar with this book. It's called Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, and it's by a Dr. Geleb Tispersky, Tspurski. And we actually put in guidelines around the guidance from this book, and it has proven data included in it. And I won't go through all of what it is he shares in the book, but I would encourage others, as they continue to think about their remote work environments, to give it a read. It's an easy read, not a hard read. I know some of us, I do a lot of things virtual, Audible, that's my style. But this book I bought, and it's got lots of notes and stuff in it. But some of the things that we are thinking about, or were thinking about doing, was scheduling on-site team meetings and retreats, right, in order to bring employees together in some way. But don't hold these meetings for the sake of holding them. Come with, strategic, specific purposes, right? Why are we here? Well, we can take advantage of putting in place department strategies. We could have cross-departmental collaboration opportunities, team building exercises, professional development training. How about team professional development training? So when you have these on-site meetings and retreats, come with a clear agenda. And I'm also a fan of bringing in outside speakers, individuals who can motivate and inspire the staff in the space or industry that they work from. Another one that I became a fan of was conducting hybrid meetings. Now, this might sound a little weird to some, but it was something that I'm a fan of. So we are here. We could have a meeting. We don't necessarily have to have our speakers on. But what if I need some help from you, Ramona? You're on my team. Can I ask you that real time, live, with my other colleagues around, who might also be able to provide some insight? So you schedule these hybrid meetings for everybody on the team to be involved. Now, there are big teams, 50 people, there are 10 people. So you kind of parse out where the focus can be for each of the groups. You group them up, and you have these types of meetings. And then you also, when you have meetings, have someone who can engage the remote staff, and we call those remote facilitators. It's spoken about in the book. So if I'm not speaking and I'm remote, the facilitator, hey, Marcia, do you have any thoughts about what's going on here? And they co-partner with the leader in having the discussion. And that is very helpful, because it shows that that you're interested in what your remote staff has to say, because sometimes a lot of organizations, folks have their cameras off, so you're not really sure whether or not they're engaged, and that's a way to encourage engagement, not force it. Encourage it. There are key words here. We're not forcing anybody to do things, but we do want to hear what they have to say. And then, another thing that I was a fan of, and everybody might have employee bios, right? Employees might have bios, but what about internal bios? I'm not a morning person, not by any stretch of the imagination. So when you schedule a 9 or 10 o'clock meeting, I'm slapping my head. Like, why are we doing this at 10 o'clock in the morning? couldn't we do it like a little later? Well, if I had a bio that kind of told you what my preference is as it relates to timing of meetings, that would help. My collaboration style, that's kind of important. How do I communicate? What's the best way for me to communicate? And talk about my areas of expertise. And does it always have to be about business in these bios that we set up and share with one another? What are my hobbies? I like to play pool. I'm not a good pool player, but I do like to play. I never get it right though. But I like you to know that I'm out there trying. I also like to bowl, so these personal bios, employee bios help to build team collaboration. Because if I like ice cream, I'm sure Ramona or Jomana, you might like ice cream. What's your flavor? And the next time that we come into a meeting or have one of these team meetings, maybe that's in the house, so it's little things like that in order to continue to build. And again, I would encourage folks to take a look at the book that I mentioned. They have some really proven techniques and skills that I have also been able to incorporate in the environments that I worked in. So I hope this is helpful to others.
These are some really good practical tips. And I love the idea of separating the person who's facilitating or encouraging remote employees to contribute, but also monitoring sort of the remote participation as a separate role from the meeting facilitator or leader. Not only does it demonstrate the importance of it, right, demonstrating that we care about inclusivity, but also it makes it so much easier to separate the two and then give sufficient attention to each role. Love that. Jomana, how about you? What would you add as sort of lessons learned, best practices?
Kind of going back to the communication gap that I think is a struggle for almost all organizations. With community, when we first went remote first, one of our strategies was building communication guidelines on, how do we communicate? What are the expectations of communication? And training our leaders on effective communication to ensure that they knew how to support their teams, and their teams also knew what was expected of them. So, I would strongly recommend for any organizations that are remote first, look at what structures you have in place that really guide your employees on how do they operate, how do they behave, how do they communicate, but also train your leaders on those guidelines and expectations on effective communication. So that would be, I can't stress enough when I kind of distinguish remote friendly and remote first. There's a very, very big gap there in becoming, a lot of us say we're remote first, but we're truly remote friendly. So really take a hard look at, what structures do you have in place, what guidelines, what expectations that support your remote first environment. Because you can't assume that everyone knows how to communicate in your environment.
Excellent. And can I just say, Jomana, I love that you keep bringing up communication. I really got to admit that, because it is so important for in the remote environment, communicating clearly with employees and your leaders, right? Or your leaders should be communicating clearly, and that encompasses a whole lot of things as it relates to goal setting, right? As it relates to when you're trying to give feedback, allowing that space in order to do that, especially in a hybrid first or remote environment. People can sometimes become distant because you're distant. You're not asking them, how's it going? You're not asking them what the support is that they need. In person, it's easier to do that. Remotely, we're just making the assumption that it's happening. But it might not be happening. And because the employee doesn't want to come off as they don't know what it is they're doing, they're not saying anything. And it's our responsibility to ask a simple question. How's it going? Is there any support that I can provide? What can we do to make sure that you're successful? That's real, and that's something that we should be comfortable with doing. Giving constructive, remember that word, constructive feedback, when needed, and just checking things out. That's all it's really about, checking things out.
I think the key word is you need to be very intentional with remote environments and hybrid environments. What came very effortless and unconsciously for us in in-person environments, we have to be very intentional and think very hard about how we approach that in remote environments. So everything requires intention and structure. And I think that's the biggest key takeaway with remote environments.
Yeah, and I think even on that, right, the expectations that we have or assumptions that we make in a in-person environment, we kind of pick up on these things as we work together. But then once we're in a remote environment, all these assumptions are still in our heads, expectations are still on the table, but other people don't pick it up as easily, especially as we have new joiners come into the company. With what they think may be an early morning meeting may not be what you think is an early morning meeting, right? So these things need to be communicated. And also, I think when it comes to leadership, sort of the culture that we're trying to establish, I often see companies talk about leadership principles, which is great. I think it's a fabulous start. Many companies don't have that, but once they do, they set out their principles. And then I think really in a remote friendly environment, to Jomana's point, we need to not just have principles, but also talk about what does that look like in the day-to-day environment. What are we expecting in terms of goal setting, onboarding structures, feedback conversations, coaching employees, learning and development, and the list goes on. But what are some of the key pillars that we expect from leaders to execute in order to fulfill and live up to our principles?
I would like to share this, so it sometimes comes as a missing piece. Ramona and Jomana, have we clearly defined what our culture is? I have always been of the understanding that people are the culture. We embed, we advocate, we ambassadors for the culture. But the organization needs to define what its culture is, and it's not the same across many organizations. There are some that are hierarchical. There are some that are flat. There are some that have open door policies. There are some that don't, and that's unfortunate. Not all. So let me preface that. But there's a way that we operate within our environment. So how are we communicating that in a remote environment, or our new hires understanding how we operate from as an organization from a cultural perspective? What is the company's culture? That is something that I believe really needs to be defined, as well as what is leadership? Leadership at our organization. How have we defined it? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? How do I become a leader? If I don't know what it is, how can I possibly become it in this particular organization? So there are definitions that need to be established in organizations as they continue to move forward. Neither one of us yet have mentioned, or any of us have mentioned, the importance of assessments. Readiness assessments. What are we ready for as an organization, and what type of assessment will provide us with the insight we need in order to move forward? And Jomana, you're an HR professional, and I don't know, and Ramona as well, how many employee engagement and satisfaction surveys can we have, right, in a year? Now we have pulse surveys. For me, I'm a little surveyed out. So are you taking the survey information and then having focus groups or follow-up conversations to dig a little deeper so that you can really understand what's going on? And that's critical in a remote environment. It is critical. So I just wanted to lean in a little bit about definitions, the importance of surveys, and the importance of assessments. Though I'm a little survey weary, they are valuable to understand where employees are. Not the organization is, but where the employees are within the organization.
Right. I think, sorry, Ramona, I think just to close that on surveys, I think they're so valuable, but we need to be very careful with, post survey. And that is the most important aspect of launching a survey, is what do you do afterwards? And I've been part of organizations where surveys were done and nothing happened afterwards. No follow-up, no readout, no action plan, not even an appreciation. And, that was why engagement was so low, or participation in surveys was so low. So the follow-up, the action plan, and the feedback directly to your team post surveys and assessments is so important to keep that engagement high, and to show them, you hear them, they're, you've taken their feedback, and this is what you're going to do moving forward. So that is, just getting the information and the feedback is not where you stop. Post that is so crucial.
Yeah, good stuff. Mm-hmm.
So speaking about where are employees at, when you think about specific skills leaders need to develop, and if you think about establishing a leadership development program for leaders who are working in a virtual or remote environment or have team members in that setup, what are some of the critical skills that you think these leadership development programs need to focus on so that the leaders are prepared to lead teams successfully in remote and hybrid setups?
Mm-hmm.
Jomana, let's go with you first.
Yep.
Oh, I feel like I'm just going to be a broken record. Effective communication.
I was going to say.
Effective communication needs to be part of that. But, I've already talked about that enough, but I think I also want to talk about like tech savviness. And I think that's a skill that's overlooked in remote environments. We've shifted, or you've always been remote, whatever the case might be for your organization. And we've launched all these tech stacks for your team, assuming that everyone knows how to use them. And typically it might come with a little bit of a learning, and then everyone's off on their own. But we also have to remember that the generations we're managing grew up with tech from, the minute they were out of the womb. And those who are potentially leading didn't have that, and have been exposed to it in the last 10 years as tech has really blown up for us in organizations in our tech stack. So really ensuring that they are proficient with the tools that we are putting in place. Giving them tools is not enough. Ensuring that they are using them effectively is so crucial. When we went remote first at Community, one of our initiatives was actually doing tech surveys and assessing, do they have the tools that they need to be successful? What are the gaps? Do they need more training? And we did that yearly to just assess, is there anywhere we can support them to ensure that they have what they need and they're set up for success? Not just in terms of, do you have the tools, but do you know how to use the tools as well? So I think that is something that sometimes is overlooked because we just assume everyone is tech savvy because we all have an iPhone or an Android phone or some sort of smartphone. So I would say between those two, those are really important skills that we should tackle.
Excellent.
Great ones. Marcia, what'd you add?
I would definitely just want to, echo that technology and communication, once again, it just keeps coming up, is critical. But I really like the fact, Jomani, that you leaned in technology. A lot of times we assume, like you said, that people know how to use certain technology. Many organizations, as we know, are using Teams, right, as a platform. They're using SharePoint as a platform. They're using OneDrive as a platform. And let me not leave out Slack. One that I'm continuing to get my arms around because it's out there. So technology is a big deal. Another thing that I believe leaders should be aware of is their own biases in the workplace. And I'm not just talking about from a diversity perspective. I'm talking about from the organizational biases. If it was invented here, syndrome bias, that's what I call it, then they're cautious about the practices, be they best practices or not. There's confirmation biases. We ignore information that contradicts our own beliefs, from an organizational perspective. And one that I'm sure we have all run into, it's the illusion of control bias. That's what I call it. If I see you, I have better control over you. Not. I don't believe in that. The remote environment and the hybrid environment has showed us that productivity actually spikes for remote employees. And that is not in question anymore. So that idea of control, because I can see you, and overestimating the control that we have really needs to be looked at. And then there are other biases that are out there from an organizational perspective that leaders have, and they need to become aware of those and what they are and why they exist. I think is very important. And then again, the importance of providing feedback, the communication, like Jomana and I have been sharing, those all come into play. And then, how we look at productivity these days. I will share this. I've been looking at quality over quantity, right? There's some people that it takes them a longer time to get things done, and they come back with real quality deliverables. And then there are others who are able to do it really quick, right? And they come back with quality deliverables. So are we looking at, how quick folks are doing, the quantity that they're doing, the number of things that we're doing, or we're looking at the quality of work and tying it into the impact that that's having on organizational success? That is so important. Looking at the different ways that people work and what they're bringing to the table. So I think that's another area that our leaders should really become comfortable with. The status quo is not the status quo anymore. Things have changed without your permission.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think with the productivity there too, the creative environment that we need to foster and nurture, especially as we think about the introduction of AI as well, where speed no longer really is that critical factor for impact.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The one thing that I would want to add here to the list of critical skills is active listening. And I think specifically what I have a lot of leaders that I talk with, what they're challenged with is to really build rapport and better understand their employees when they're not in the same location. And you see when are they stressed or when are things not going well, and be able to intervene. Because it's easy to sort of put up a nice face and to, show that everything is under control for the hour that I'm in a meeting with someone. And then afterwards I have anxiety, or I have an emotional load that I'm dealing with, or I feel overwhelmed, or I'm just unclear of what was actually explained to me or what I was supposed to be doing. And if a leader isn't able to pick up on that and navigate those conversations, to read between the line and ask really good questions that would uncover some of those things that they may not see once we turn off the screens or jump out of these meetings, that to me makes a big difference as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, I want to move a bit to the conversation around leadership development and training. In one hand, as we're looking at time here, so as we're looking at both formats of what you have implemented or what you have experimented with or considered in the past, as well as technology that might support leadership development in a remote environment. What are some of the best practices? And Marcia, let's start with you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Not new, but definitely being lifted up in remote environments is simulation training, which I believe has been very, very helpful to many of the leaders that I have worked with in virtual role play. And what that allows, as it did previously, is to test, right? Test your knowledge, test your skills, so that you can become better at it. That's all that development is about. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. You might be doing all the right things, but can we enhance your skill set? Can we give you the tools, knowledge, and expertise? And I believe that social simulations and virtual role plays are very, very helpful with that. And that's something that I've incorporated and will continue to incorporate. And a lot of the trainings now are simulated. When you're taking sexual harassment training, they're simulations, workplace practices trainings, they're simulated. Well, how about leadership development training? Can we get more of the platforms out there to consider that as a way forward? In order to support our leaders. So yeah, those are two that I really wanted to lift up during this conversation.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
We are echoing the same thing. It's so important to make sure they're, interactive. I know gamified learning is skyrocketing right now. in terms of keeping folks engaged, because it's scenario-based, it's very practical for them in terms of learning. So ensure, whatever it might be that you are delivering as in terms of a leadership training, or even just training and development in general, it is interactive, it's personalized, it's not, too generic, and that they have, opportunities to provide feedback. It's not just a one-way training where we're just listening, but there's a two-way the kind of communication and strategy there. So I'm seeing gamified learning really take off here, and it's something that especially the younger generations enjoy in terms of learning, and they're quite engaged. But I think the biggest piece is ensure, one, it's interactive, two, it's not just one way in terms of how that learning is being received.
Any additions that you want to make in terms of technology beyond the simulations or the VR experiences platforms that you would recommend, that you think would be useful for people to hear about? Any shout outs you want to make before we wrap?
I'll just say this. A lot of the HRIS systems have great learning platforms, and if you've signed on the dotted line with most of them, they offer sometimes free courses, soft skills and hard skills that can be utilized. And I lift them up because that came through for at the last company that I was with. ADP has a wonderful platform. Not everybody's a fan of ADP, and there are others out there, but dig into what it is they offer. And I did want to share this as well, Ramona. Allowing employees to self-serve. Right. There are opportunities that are available that we can coach and motivate and encourage our staff to take advantage of from a self-serve as it relates to IRS platforms, and also encouraging professional development for seminars, webinars like this, online courses, on-demand courses. Open up your leadership opportunity playbook. Think about what it is but also think about what it is you don't know, and lean into getting that knowledge, skills, and expertise, because I will say, for me, it has been so valuable as I continue to grow in my professional career, even as a senior leader. You don't have all the answers, but you can get more information to build what I call my professional portfolio.
Great. Thank you.
I get my shout outs. We use Namely in terms of, compliance learning. And I think they do it quite well, where it's not, one, very redundant, two, you're just listening for hours about, sexual harassment and unconscious bias. But it's very interactive, not in a sense where the employee is live interactive, but it does include kind of a gamified component to ensure they're engaged throughout the process. But in terms of leadership development, we use Culture Amp in terms of performance reviews. And I think they do a really good job, whether it's for performance reviews, career pathing conversations that we might do, or just encouraging a continuous feedback loop. When we launch programs, it kind of prompts our managers with learnings ahead of going into the review cycle, or ahead of going into career development conversations. So it kind of engages them in a way where, it kind of gives them like a 5-minute e-learning that they can, it doesn't take too much of their time. And we do see some engagement there as we go into different development cycles. So they do it quite well in terms of being interactive and giving those spot on e-learnings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm recapping. On one hand, sort of shorter sessions, engagement, interactivity, gamifying it as a really good practices. I also always like to say with workshops, we try to expand the span of time that someone is engaged with that topic, with pre-work, pre-assignments, workshops, reading materials, surveys, whatever we can run in order for it to be top of mind, not just during a 90-minute block, but weeks in advance and weeks after the session.
Yeah.
Wonderful. This was very insightful. Thank you both of you for making the time to have this conversation. I bet we could keep talking, but I'm being mindful of the time that we have allotted for this panel. I appreciate you making the time and sharing this. I will recap some of the insights and add them to the comments below. Thank you, Jomana. Thank you, Marcia, and also a shout out to Andrea, who was trying to join as well, but sometimes technology doesn't play along. So thank you, Andrea, for aiming to, and we hope to have you on a different panel. Thank you both, and a good rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.